So for Deathwatch, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves and Black Templars, is their unique detachment the best, or is it better to go with the standard Gladius? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk over the Divergent Space Marine chapters and see how their own unique detachments are faring against the Gladius Task Force, the other choice that they have for running their armies. It seems that in Games Workshop's eventual plan for Warhammer 40K 10th edition, basically every army is going to have the choice of multiple different detachments to run, different playstyles that they can use for their army. They've given us examples of things like Tyranid infiltration swarms or monster-focused formations, or things like a Space Marine First Company task force, for things that we might expect in the upcoming codexes in autumn. Currently, it means that the only armies that actually have a choice of detachment happen to be these oddball Space Marine chapters. They all still have the Adeptus Astartes keyword, and there's no restriction on them running the Gladius Task Force, but they also all have a unique detachment of their own. The only major restrictions on those being that you can't take units for Divergent chapters that aren't the one that's supposed to be taking them. So for example, a Dark Angel's Unforgiven Task Force, you couldn't take any Space Wolves unique units in that, or say Ironfather Phyros or Rabute Gilliman out of the main Space Marine Codex. All of these chapters can fully use the Gladius Task Force and still use all their unique units in that though, so you could use a Gladius Task Force with a whole bunch of Death Company from the Blood Angels or Thunderwolves from the Space Wolves. It is kind of weird that with the Gladius rules it actually means that you don't have any restrictions on any units that they can take, so strangely enough you could have say High Marshal Helbrecht and Chaplain Grimaldus fighting alongside some Black Templar librarians, or Deathwatch with access to the full list of Space Marine units and don't get any locked out. Obviously not very fluffy there, and it doesn't really add all that much in my opinion. The only major trade-offs for using the Gladius over their own unique one are the rule stratagems and enhancements of their own unique formation, plus not being able to use any other chapters things, say like Ultramarines or Iron Hand stuff if you happen to be running standard Space Marines. Just purely from a lore and feel point of view, I feel like most of these chapters would generally prefer to be running their own unique detachment if it was equally strong. It's quite nice to have some flavoured rules tailored around your army doing what it does best, whether it's Blood Angels, Savage Assaults, or Space Wolves doing sagas. I feel like a lot of people just see the Gladius Task Force as being a bit more standard Space Marine really, even if it does make sense that all of these can field some balanced tactical forces if they want to with a little bit of assault and shooting. In the video I thought we'd talk through the Gladius Task Force, then talk through each one of these unique detachments in its turn, and see how they're doing in terms of some grand tournament data. For this one I took a look at the stats from StatCheck 40K, an online resource that looks at grand tournament data, has win rates and much more besides. Thoroughly recommend checking that out. Starting out with the Gladius though, and this is what the other chapter's unique detachments will be competing against, and the Gladius brings these rules in addition to the standard stuff that all the Space Marines get, like Oath of Moment. The main rule is combat doctrines, kinda nice and simple, 1 turn of advance and shoot, 1 turn of advance and charge, and 1 turn of fallback shoot and charge. All quite powerful move and damage abilities, quite good for keeping Space Marines relentlessly on the attack and hitting the enemy hard. I think Devastator Doctrine is generally likely to be used early in the game for advance and shoots to get some lines of fire early on. Assault Doctrine's pretty excellent for getting some very long charges off or very reliable charges off. And then Tactical is maybe a bit more situational depending on what you've got locked in melee. Might be the best option or just a nice to have to get one unit to have a bit more flexibility. Then it's got a whole cluster of stratagems, Lance melee and a +1 AP in Assault, 2 CP fight on death, 1 command point to flex the combat doctrines, which I think is particularly important for the advance and charge. Quite nice just to be able to do that full stop. Though advance and shoot could be pretty handy if say you both need to get to an objective and you don't want to sacrifice your fire. Otherwise there's a 1 CP for ignore cover and a +1 AP in Devastator Doctrine. Squad Tactics is a nice tricky one for a reactive move of d6 inches with a squad, could be enough to keep a unit safe unexpectedly. And finally 1 command point for Armour of Contempt, worsening the AP of enemy attacks, though all the other detachments get that as well. Generally I'd rate that as a strong stratagem section, lots of very usable options there, and then out of the enhancements there's only one that I really like, which is Bolter Discipline. A nice simple sustained hits one when you're shooting with a unit, so it's pretty excellent for leaders in things like Hellblasters or Sternguard or Desolation squads. And then when you're in Devastator Doctrine you get 5+ critical hits as well, so extra sustained hits there, and doubly powerful if it's with a lieutenant for lethal hits too. Means you can have one unit led by a character that's just excessively shooty. Overall I think it does quite a good job of being a well-rounded force, really quite nice both for range and melee armies, and I think it does pay to have a bit of both given the way that the doctrines work. and it looks like standard Space Marines overall are doing sort of mediocre with it. Loads of ridiculously scary stuff in Warhammer 40K at the moment. They've got a 44% win rate in grand tournaments according to StatCheck. Certainly not super strong, but there's armies doing far worse. They are sort of middle of the table. Let's talk through the Divergent chapter detachments though, what they add, and whether they seem to be doing better compared with the Gladius. Black Templars get their Righteous Crusaders, quite often just used for a 6+ feel no pain being the most popular one, though depending on the enemy you could go for one of the melee damage ones, say for example lethal hits if you're fighting all monsters or vehicles. Perhaps my favourite enhancement out of them is the Tannhauser's Bones, the one that gives you the 5+ feel no pain to a unit, which is really quite big on a big tanky unit of Crusaders or Terminators, and it also gives you a personal half damage as well. Quite expensive, but well worth it I think. Then I think a few of the stratagems are okay as well. Perhaps my favourite one out of the unique ones is to keep a unit in melee. On a 4+ they can't fall back, and even if they can they have to check Desperate Escape, which is quite big, and otherwise you can flex vows, get extra AP in combat, and Armour of Contempt of course. By the numbers according to StatCheck, it looks like the Righteous Crusaders is doing a little bit better in grand tournaments, though it does seem to be really quite balanced against the Gladius, only a 46% win rate on Righteous Crusaders and 43% on the Gladius. The Gladius does seem to be played by very few players though, given that things seem to be at least somewhat even. Perhaps it's not too surprising that people prefer their unique fluffy detachments. Overall seems quite good that Righteous Crusaders does enough to compete well. I guess super tanky bricks of Crusaders with 5+ feel no pains from the Tannhauser's Bones and Grimalda seem kind of cool. Next up for the Dark Angels, and they get their Unforgiven Task Force. Games Workshop's attempts to somehow make Battleshock relevant by making it actually a good thing for the Dark Angels forces to fail. They might still have some issues, but it seems to make their enhancements and stratagems better, and they still count as being Objective Control 1 even if they're Battleshocked, so it means that they don't suddenly lose objectives by a bad roll at least. Realistically though, I think the core ability is very weak. I think you could go a few games without it being relevant, though every so often it might score you some victory points that you might have lost otherwise. For enhancements, there's a few interesting ones, the Heavenfall Blade being an okay character damage boost, and the 6+ feel no pain from the Pennant of Remembrance is quite a good draw to actually using an Ancient. Could be kind of nice to give that sort of boost to a great big Terminator block. Otherwise I think that the formation stratagems are okay. There's a 1 command point for a -1 damage in melee, which could be kind of huge on damage 2 or damage 3 attacks. I do quite like their Return Fire one. If you've taken a casualty, you can shoot straight back, and there's a couple of minor ones for lethal hits or gaining assault heavy or ignores cover. Both of those could help out shooting in the right circumstances. I think perhaps unsurprisingly with the core Battleshock special rule though, it does look like the Dark Angels aren't doing all that well. Running them in the Gladius Task Force seems to give them a much better result compared with the Unforgiven Task Force, though it is kind of interesting that the Unforgiven Task Force was still taken by more players than the Gladius. I guess maybe implying that it's not so bad that people are wholesale abandoning it, even if it does look like it gives you a lower chance of winning overall. Does seem like it's a big win for the Gladius in any case though, massive great big difference there. To be honest, I feel like getting so many things dependent on units failing Battleshock for Dark Angels really did seem like it was going to be kind of niche, unless things like the stratagems and enhancements were absolutely god tier in terms of support. Next up, for another army that's maybe got slightly questionable core mechanics, are the Space Wolves with their Champions of Rust. Their main mechanic in their detachment are Sagas, 4 different buffs that you can try and activate throughout the game. You have to have your characters do certain quests or actions basically, kill some notable things or take some damage and not die. Definitely can happen, but it feels like for the majority of them, you're kind of going to be unlikely to absolutely be able to guarantee them against the vast majority of the opponents. It means that if you don't get lucky in the first few turns, you might be having basically no detachment rule for a fair bit, and good buffs could snowball, but they could arrive too late as well. The enhancements, I must admit, I'm super not really sold on the Space Wolf ones. They're generally just minor personal damage or defensive boosts, and in combat they do have a few interesting ones. 1 command point to activate a Saga for a unit, a 1 command point for lance melee weapons, Armour of Contempt, and many get better if you can activate the Saga, though again that's kind of dependent on what happens in the game. Again, for the Space Wolves, I think that most people would have probably predicted that they were going to do better with the Gladius as soon as they saw the detachments. Seems they get around about a 46% win rate with the Gladius, or a 32% win rate with the Champions of Rust detachment, and they're the only army that the Gladius actually seems to be played more in grand tournaments, as opposed to the sub-faction's own unique detachment. I guess even more so than the Dark Angels, shows that Space Wolf players aren't particularly convinced by those sagas and being able to activate them reliably. I guess at least in the Gladius you get 3 turns of reliable buffs, even if they might not be quite as strong as multiple layered sagas should you activate them. And in particular, reliable advance and charge does seem like quite a nice advantage for the Wolves. That's a powerful stratagem that they don't have access to in the Champions detachment. Next up, we've got the Blood Angels, and their unique detachment is Sons of Sanguinius. Their Red Thirst ability is a flat melee boost, a +1 attack, and +1 strength when they're on the charge. The +1 attack will make just about any Space Marine melee unit just that bit more fearsome. The +1 strength is maybe a bit dependent on exactly what you're fighting, might be a bit more useful against things that say toughness 4, toughness 5, but against a lot of big tough vehicles it might make no difference whatsoever. For their enhancements, they've got a couple of personal damage boosts, though I think my favourite two are probably the two buffing ones. The Icon of the Angel to force desperate escape checks on the enemy. That's really quite a nice ability, particularly as you can pile in a long distance with one of their stratagems, plus it's actually cheap enough to be usable at only 10 points. And there's also a slightly more expensive one that halves enemy objective control if they're within combat. I'd rate that as a bit more questionable unless you had literally nothing else to spend the points on. For their stratagems, they get a very hard-hitting one in Red Rampage, 1 command point for both lance and lethal hits. Does mean that one unit can just slam home very hard when they want to. Otherwise though, I'm maybe a bit less convinced by a few of the rest of them. I've got Armour of Contempt again, Fight and Death, and a big 6-inch Consolidate one which I guess could be quite powerful situationally. Tag more enemy units that don't really want to be in combat, could be a big on a squad that takes that icon perhaps. Again, like the Space Wolves though, it seems that the Assault chapters seem to be doing better with the Gladius. Again, really quite a big win difference here. 49% wins by the people who take the Gladius Task Force, and only 40% by the people who take the Sons of Sanguinius. Again, kind of notable that more people are running Sons of Sanguinius though, staying true to their Blood Angels nature and not playing them as Red Ultramarines or whatever. Again, I can see why though. Great big units of Assault Marines with advance and charge seems very scary. You've still got a stratagem to be able to access Lance in the Gladius, and you still have access to Oath of Moment either way to layer on the damage, even if the Blood Angels do lack their red thirst that they get from Sons of Sanguinius. Finally, we come to the Deathwatch. They seem to be taking on the role of fearsome shooting marines these days. They get their Black Spear Task Force, and they have mission tactics with that. 3 turns of really quite great damage buffs to be honest. Sustained hits on everything for a turn, lethal hits on everything for a turn, and then critical hits become precision attacks if you need to take out some characters. Basically feels like combat doctrines pretty much, but based on damage as opposed to movement buffs. These are quite a solid special rule, as they do actually boost the damage output of shooting Space Marines, which none of the other detachments really do, at least not innately on their army rule. Then a few of their enhancements are good as well. I feel like the Tome of Ectoclades is by far the standout one for a turn of double Oath of Moment, yet more damage into important enemy units. Though I feel like the Beacon Angelus is okay for deep strike for a squad that can't, plus free rapid ingress, and they do have a damage dealer if you want a melee brawler for an extra AP strength and damage for one character. Then for the stratagems, they have yet more damage in the shooting phase, a trio of special issue ammunition stratagems, various buffs like anti-infantry, which is kind of brutal when you apply it to things like Desolation Marines, but I think all of these special issue ammo strats are usable, and you can apply them for 1 command point to 2 different Deathwatch kill teams as well, making them ridiculously efficient on those already fairly scary units. You can also flexibly change out a mission tactic as well to get either sustained hits, lethal hits, or more precision chances if it's vital. Some teleportarium redeploys, and Armour of Contempt on the defensive. Perhaps unsurprisingly, with all the different ways that they can get really quite good shooting buffs within the detachments, they seem to be doing very well indeed for Space Marines. It looks like just about every Deathwatch player who's playing in Grand Tournaments is running the Black Spear Task Force over the Gladius. Deathwatch Gladius seems to be basically unplayed, unlike any of the other chapters, and the Black Spear Task Force appears to have a win rate of around 52% at Grand Tournaments, far higher than the standard Gladius Space Marine average of 44%. Overall, it seems that at the moment, Deathwatch are perhaps the most competitive way to play standard Space Marines, and the way to do so is with a whole bunch of shooting damage with their kill teams and things via the Black Spear Task Force. It does double down really quite nicely with the Oath of Moment and things like Desolation Squads, which can be kind of horrendous in Deathwatch. Their kill teams with a whole bunch of intimidating frag cannons, Infernus heavy bolters, and Terminators with heavy weapons do seem pretty scary as well. So overall, coming back to the original question then, whether the Gladius Task Force is better for each of these Divergent chapters, looks like it does seem to be superior for the Blood Angels, Dark Angels and Space Wolves, but appears not to be for the Black Templars. Their own detachment and the Gladius seem to be kind of balanced, with their own detachment winning out slightly, and it's very much not so for the Deathwatch, who seem to be massively ahead with their own Black Spear task force to the extent where no one takes the Gladius. Let me know if that was what you were expecting or not down in the comments. I can't really say it surprised me too much though. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's linked down in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.